Good morning again. Senate Agriculture back in action. We're going to spend some time talking about the Clean Water Performance Report. We have Secretary Julie Moore, Agency of Natural Resources, with us today, and some of her people. And Secretary, would you like to lead off?
I would. Thank you.
Yes, welcome.
So good morning. For the record, Julie Moore, Secretary of Natural Resources, and I am joined this morning by two colleagues from ANR, Emily Bird, who is with us remotely up in the upper corner of the screen there, who is the Clean Water Initiative Program Manager, and then also Claire Madden, who is the Data Tracking and Accounting Supervisor, also with the Clean Water Initiative Program. And then Laura DePietro from the Agency of Agriculture, because the report we're going to talk to you about is actually a whole of government report. The team at DEC leads the development of this annual performance report, but it is comprehensive and covers the work being done by the Agency of Agriculture, as well as the Agency of Transportation, a little bit of work in this space by the Agency of Commerce and Community Development, and to the best of our ability, some of the federal partner contributions to this work. So the release of the annual Clean Water Performance Report for me is always very exciting. I think you'll find that the information Emily and Claire will share provides a really comprehensive look at these significant investments that Vermont is making in water quality. And the work reflects the impact of literally tens of millions of dollars in state and federal funds that we have used to make, and most recently through ARPA and the bipartisan infrastructure law, really accelerate our investments in this work. And this includes things like refurbishing aged wastewater infrastructure and addressing combined sewer overflows, improving statewide stormwater management, and then also helping to support the adoption of best management practices on our farms and also in our forests. And so in this really strong body of work, I also see strong parallels for what is needed in climate action, and just encourage you to sort of keep that in mind as we work through this review of the performance report today. I would offer our clean water work is based on a thoughtful implementation strategy with clear priorities that help us ensure our investments really align with our long-term clean water goals. This is a 20-year effort. We are in year 8, so not quite to the halfway mark, but it's important to recognize it was always planned as a 20-year effort, just given the magnitude of what's needed here. And so with every dollar we invest in clean water, it really represents.
And I'm sorry, is it okay if I?
Please.
And I may be jumping ahead, so you can just say, I'm going to get to that.
Yeah.
You're at the 8-year mark. Is there an assessment of, so you're going to get to that. So I'm going to shut up and let you go ahead.
So I can just pause here and let you know the way the presentation will roll out. So my remarks are real high level. Emily's going to talk about the overall structure for our clean water work, what the obligations are we have to EPA, how we set about approaching them, a little bit of the history. And then Claire will jump into, I think, very much what you're asking, sort of what are we seeing on the ground in terms of projects and in terms of outputs, and then finally in terms of outcomes.
And one more question, and you just mentioned EPA. With different administrations, those goals from federal change, do you adjust accordingly, or do you stay on the course of goals that we have?
We stay the course with the goals that we have. So what underlies all of this work is something called a TMDL, or total maximum daily load, and it's essentially a pollution budget. And that pollution budget reflects the state adopted water quality standards and criteria that we have for Lake Champlain or Lake Memphremagog. EPA approves those standards, but those standards are ours and are the underlying basis for the reductions we're working to achieve under the TMDL.
Now I'll shut up.
Questions are
Please
always
don't.
welcome.
See.
We're not a very good committee of shutting up, so, and I hope
No,
that always
questions are welcome throughout. So I was just gonna say that every dollar we're investing in clean water represents a choice about priorities, because with a 20-year plan, it means there is significantly more work that lies ahead than we have dollars in the current year to perform. And so this performance report really provides that comprehensive accounting of how we're investing those dollars, how we're leveraging those dollars, and then the outcomes that are being achieved. And just as a point of reference, as some of you may know, I managed what was called the Clean and Clear program from 2008 to 2011 that has evolved into the Clean Water Initiative program. The final budget I worked on in my capacity as Clean and Clear program manager in FY11 included a little over $1 million in grant funds. In and then in FY18, which was the first year that we have in our performance report, there was about $50 million that was shown. And what you're going to see is in the last year, we have invested upwards of $185 million in clean water. A lot of this is passed through federal grants and contracts. But I think what I hope you take away from this is the sort of infrastructure that Emily and her team have built allowed us to scale up very quickly, to take full advantage of these federal funds, to make investments that should help accelerate our work over the next several years towards achieving those clean water goals. But it's a function of going back to having this really good plan that we're working from and a really clear process for deciding on how to set our priorities. And so with that, we'll turn it over to Emily to sort of give you that context and background, and then Claire will share the data.
Thank you so much. Can everybody hear me okay in the committee room?
Yes.
Thank you so much for having us in this morning. For the record, my name is Emily Bird, and I'm the Clean Water Initiative Program Manager at DEC. And I'm joined by my colleague, Claire Madden, who is our Tracking and Accounting Supervisor. We're going to give you an overview of some clean water background, as Secretary Moore introduced, and walk you through some of the findings in this year's performance report. Okay, oops, I'm just getting the slides to advance. There we go. So Claire and I are here today to represent the whole interagency effort that is underway in the state of Vermont to support clean water work. And our program, the Clean Water Initiative program, plays a pretty lead role in helping to coordinate those efforts across state and federal agencies. We are housed in the Agency of Natural Resources, Department of Environmental Conservation, Water Investment Division, and our program has a three-part mission where we work to align and coordinate clean water efforts statewide, to develop financial and technical resources to implement and sustain projects, and to capture and assess and communicate the progress and impact of clean water efforts. So today's performance report presentation is really focused on the third component of our program's mission, and the performance report is a primary function of our program, where we're providing that accountability back to the legislature, the public, and the Environmental Protection Agency on the investments that are being made in clean water, the results that are associated with those investments, and also the regulatory programs that are underway to support clean water and what outcomes are associated with all of those efforts. But this report is so much more than a report. It really is a compilation of all of the great work underway by many partners across the federal, state, and local level. And it's an important planning tool. It provides us with data on how we're doing and where we need to continue to adapt and target resources to address gaps. And we'll get more into that as we move through the presentation. But just wanted to acknowledge the partnership of putting this report together. And while it takes time to compile these data, conduct the quality assurance, quality control, and to prepare this report, it is really a useful resource to help to improve our efforts as we move through this implementation process. A little bit of background on the structure for water quality work in Vermont. Here in Vermont, we're very fortunate that most of our waters are really high quality and support many important uses like recreation, drinking water, aesthetic value, fishing. They serve as great habitat for fish and wildlife. So for the most part, Vermont's waters are in good shape. But there are some waters that suffer from excess pollution that require restoration. And in the state of Vermont, most of our water quality challenges where water bodies are not meeting standards is tied back to excess nutrient and sediment pollution. And nutrients are a natural part of life, but when they exist in imbalance in our environment, they can cause significant water quality challenges. For example, cyanobacteria blooms in Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog and Lake Karma, you've likely heard about, where excess phosphorus fuels these harmful and sometimes toxic algae blooms that impact our use and enjoyment of the resource. And so most of the state of Vermont has coverage by these large-scale clean water restoration plans, known as a total maximum daily load, or TMDL. And TMDLs are part of the Federal Clean Water Act. And basically how it works is we assess the condition of the waters across the state, and where a water body does not meet water quality standards due to excess pollution, the state needs to put into place a total maximum daily load, which is essentially a pollution budget or diet that identifies the amount of pollution a water body can handle and still meet those standards. So the goal isn't to completely eliminate phosphorus, for example, but to find that right balance so that the water body can still meet standards. And most of the state, as I mentioned a little bit ago, is covered by these large scale TMDLs. The western part of the state, the Lake Champlain Basin, shown here in dark green, is the Lake Champlain Basin, and all of the dark green land flows into Lake Champlain and is covered by a TMDL for phosphorus. So we've identified what phosphorus the lake can handle and still meet standards. Similarly, in the Lake Memphremagog Basin in the northeast corner of the state, Lake Memphremagog is impaired for excess phosphorus, and we have a phosphorus TMDL in place. The eastern portion of the state, the Connecticut River Valley, is part of a 5-state TMDL for Long Island Sound, because the Connecticut River flows south into the Long Island Sound, and excess nitrogen in that saltwater system is causing an imbalance that's causing low dissolved oxygen and dead zones in the sound. And so the state of Vermont is part of a 5-state effort to address nitrogen pollution into Long Island Sound. But as we're working on
Emily, just a question. Did we, the floodings of 23 and 24, did that set us back as far as where our goals were? Because
that's
water
a great
reaching areas
question.
that normally wouldn't be flushing out excess pollutant.
Yes, so certainly with the large flooding events that we've experienced recently, because so much of the pollution in the state of Vermont is driven by rain runoff and snow melt, we saw that those events carried a significant amount of sediment and phosphorus into our surface waters and into Lake Champlain. And we do have monitoring programs that are underway to track the impact of those events on the lake. But fortunately, the TMDLs that have been put into place do have a margin of safety that account for climate change and increased severity of weather events. And so it's sort of baked into the plan and our targets that these types of events will occur. And also, as we are working to implement projects that reduce this pollution, those projects also have a flood resilience benefit that help to mitigate some of the impacts of those types of events. So we are hopeful that that is all baked into the plan, and that the work we're doing to address water quality will also provide greater resilience to the severe weather events that we've been experiencing. But it is certainly something that we need to continue to monitor and adapt our approach to make sure that we're meeting water quality goals on that 20-year horizon, as Secretary Moore mentioned.
Well, I'm glad to hear it's baked into the plan, because it would be a shame that if all the good work went away because of something that was unforeseen when this goal was made, or these goals were made. So, to be accurate as far as where you are with the plan in the 8 years, to know that there is some wiggle room in that plan, and to be able to point to it and say, well, we were doing well until we had these events. And so that's why we're at where we're at. Instead of just beating yourselves up saying, well, we're failing miserably, and so we need to do better.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of work ahead to be able to meet these goals. They are aggressive goals to be able to meet. But yes, the climate aspect is incorporated into the modeling that was done to set these targets. And the work that we're doing to meet these targets will also help us to be more resilient when these types of events happen in the future, and they're likely to happen more regularly than they did previously. But yeah, that's an excellent point. Thank you for bringing that up. Okay. Oh, and I think my last point on this slide was that while we're working on implementing these large-scale restoration plans, focusing on larger water bodies like Lake Champlain and the Connecticut River, I wanted to highlight that the projects that are happening all across the landscape, across the different land use sectors. And those projects, while they are helping to meet these goals for Lake Champlain, Lake Memphremagog, Connecticut River, Long Island Sound, they also have local water quality benefits for the nearby ponds, streams, wetlands. And so the work that we're doing at this watershed scale, we like to call it, it has local benefits in addition to helping meet our goals for these larger scale restoration plans. Okay. And some additional background on the Clean Water Framework in Vermont. Vermont passed the Clean Water Act, or Act 64, in 2015, and this was really an all-in for clean water approach. And the goal behind Act 64 was acknowledging that the state of Vermont, with its rural characteristic, most of our water quality challenges or most of our pollution is transported into our waters from what we call non-point sources of pollution. So it's not necessarily the end of a pipe for our wastewater treatment facilities, but pollution across the landscape that's transported into our waterways from rain runoff and snow melt. And so we really need to put additional measures into place to provide reasonable assurances that we can address those more diffuse sources of pollution across the landscape. And this was a big part of providing the reasonable assurances that we could implement the Lake Champlain restoration plan, and providing the Federal Environmental Protection Agency that with the implementation plan that we'd be able to meet those targets for phosphorus. But then most of this work is also transferable statewide and supports other water quality priorities across the state as well. So Act 64 put into place additional water quality regulations to address additional non-point sources of pollution. So that addressed some of the agricultural sources of pollution from non-point sources through the required agricultural practices. It also updated the acceptable management practices for forestry and logging jobs in Vermont. And it established additional stormwater regulations that address the polluted runoff from our developed areas like hard surfaces and roads. So that includes the 3-acre general permit that you may have heard of, the municipal separate storm sewer system, or MS4 permit, and the municipal roads general permit, which basically targets retrofitting, putting in treatment to treat runoff from existing sources of pollution that weren't in place previously, and then upgrading our municipal road network statewide to meet a standard for water quality to reduce erosion from those road networks. But that permit program also provides a number of benefits to improving the resiliency of our road networks against more severe weather events. In addition to the water quality regulations, Act 64 established for the first time ever the state's Clean Water Fund and put into place an initial revenue stream from the property transfer tax clean water surcharge, operating at roughly $5 million a year when it was first established, but that has grown over time. We'll get into that a little bit more in the next slide. So that provides the financial incentive and assistance to help support the work that needs to happen to meet our water quality goals, and also helps to support the cost of compliance with regulations. And then the third big component of Act 64, which brings us here today, established the tracking, accounting, and reporting requirements associated with this whole framework of clean water implementation. So under Act 64, we developed a robust tracking system and a process to compile data across our interagency partnership. And today's performance report is a direct result from the Act 64 requirements. The next big piece of clean water law in Vermont is the Clean Water Service Delivery Act, or Act 76 of 2019. And this built on Act 64 by adding a long-term clean water funding source and additional revenue streams into the Clean Water Fund. So at this point today, the Clean Water Fund now receives revenues in addition to the clean water surcharge from the property transfer tax. It also receives receipts from unreturned bottle deposits and a portion of the meals and rooms tax. And so this was a big milestone for us to, as a state, meet some of the expectations for implementing the Lake Champlain TMDL that EPA was overseeing, whether we would establish a sufficient long-term funding source. So this was a really important milestone. Acknowledging that with the increased funding available to support our clean water work, we needed to start to rethink how we were getting the dollars out the door and building external capacity to really support this body of work. So Act 76 also put into place 4 additional grant programs. The first is the Water Quality Restoration Formula Grant that established decentralized entities called clean water service providers that are operating at the watershed scale and really driving local decision-making about clean water priorities. And their goal is to implement a target associated with the non-regulatory portions of the TMDL. And the funding is allocated under that formula grant program based on phosphorus targets. The other grant program is the Water Quality Enhancement Grants. That's a statewide grant program that supports water quality enhancement projects to improve water quality, but also has specific requirements to support community and watershed resilience. And then the third program is the Developed Lands Implementation Grants, which targets assistance to entities that need to comply with the 3-acre general permit. And then finally, the Municipal Stormwater Implementation Grants, which is a suite of grant programs that helps municipalities meet the costs of complying with stormwater regulations, including the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System, or MS4 program, the 3-acre general permit for municipal sites, as well as the Municipal Roads General Permit. And Act 76 also established additional reporting requirements addressing the administration of these grant programs, as well as whether these programs are sufficiently funded. And that is addressed in Appendix A of the performance report. As Secretary Moore mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, we are really working on a coordinated strategy to implement our water quality priorities as a state. And that planning process is really, and prioritization process is driven by tactical basin planning. So the state of Vermont is divided into 15 major river basins, and tactical basin plans are in place for each of those 15 river basins. And they're updated on a rotating schedule every 5 years. And basically at the watershed scale, the planning process identifies what the priority water quality concerns are for that specific watershed. So think Winooski River or Ottauquechee River Basin, we're talking at that scale. And it identifies priority actions to address those local water quality challenges. And we use this process to drive our prioritization of funding from the Clean Water Fund and through other funding programs. So this 5-year rotating schedule We look at what the priority actions are needed at that watershed scale to address water quality concerns. We monitor progress and assess how water bodies are responding to these actions and track implementation of actions as they are being completed. And then at the close of that 5-year cycle, there's a feedback loop where we see how much progress was made, what additional resources may be needed to better target gaps and to continue to improve on our work to address those water quality concerns. And then within the Lake Champlain Basin, the Lake Champlain TMDL, the restoration plan addressing phosphorus for Lake Champlain, it has an accountability framework, which is a really important part of the plan because it means that the TMDL is not just a plan that we put up on the shelf. It actually has an accountability framework where we and the Federal Environmental Protection Agency will check in on our progress and see how we're doing. And there's a whole schedule for how that works. So at a high level, the TMDL sets the overarching phosphorus reduction targets that need to be implemented on this 20-year time frame. But then those tactical basin plans that I just described to you in the previous slide, they serve also as the implementation plan for the Lake Champlain TMDL and break that 20-year implementation time frame up into 5-year increments. And at the watershed scale, think Winooski, Lamoille, Missisquoi, Otter Creek, South Lake Champlain, North Lake Champlain. The planning process helps to identify what those priority actions are needed to meet these 5-year incremental targets under the TMDL. And as those actions are being implemented, we're tracking them, we're reporting back on their results, and that's through our funding and regulatory programs. And where we can, in most cases, we estimate the phosphorus reduction associated with those actions and measure our progress against the targets in the TMDL and report back to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency on how we're doing. And the Federal Environmental Protection Agency issues report cards back to the state of Vermont to assess our progress and where we may need to do more to target resources. And so that full planning and accountability cycle happens on a 5-year rotating basis that's synced up with our tactical basin planning schedule. And halfway through a planning cycle, every 2.5 years, there's an interim report card. And then at the close of the 5-year period, there's a final report card. So this year's performance report, the performance report serves as that progress report to EPA, and then they use that as the basis to issuing our report card. And this year's performance report includes the final progress report for the Otter Creek Basin and Northern Lake Champlain for the close of its most recent 5-year report planning cycle. And it also includes an interim report, progress report for the Missisquoi and Lamoille basins. So with that I think covers some of the really important framework components for our clean water work in the state of Vermont. And I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Claire Madden, who will walk you through some of the findings in this year's performance report.
Thanks, Emily, and thanks for having us today.
I have some questions first, if possible. So on the non-point, how does Vermont compare to our other contributors such as Quebec and New York?
Great question. We have worked with Quebec and New York on agreements for implementing phosphorus reductions to Lake Champlain. New York has its own TMDL to address phosphorus pollution to Lake Champlain, and the actions and commitments that we're making are proportionate to our contribution of phosphorus to the lake. And so Vermont is responsible for about 70% of the phosphorus pollution that's going into Lake Champlain. And I think that New York is, oh gosh, I don't have it right off the top of my head, but the 30% is split up between New York and Quebec. And so the actions and commitments that each of those jurisdictions are making is proportionate to the contribution of the pollution.
And that is because of more likely our dairy farms that increase that phosphate from Vermont, or is it just the soil?
In large part, it's that we have more land area that's flowing into Lake Champlain compared to those other jurisdictions. And on the New York side, a big part of the land on the New York side that's flowing into Lake Champlain is forested land as part of the Adirondack Park. And so a big part of it is just the size of the land mass that's flowing into the lake. And then, yes, Vermont has more development and probably more acres of agriculture that are flowing into Lake Champlain compared to those other jurisdictions.
So the topography of New York is different, it's flowing in a different direction, it's flowing away from Champlain, probably because New York's a lot bigger than what Vermont is in landmass, so it just has to be the way the water's going.
Yes, exactly. New York has a number of other large-scale TMDLs that they're working to implement for Chesapeake Bay, Hudson River, for example, Great Lakes. So it's really, we're talking about the portion of New York that flows into Lake Champlain is smaller land area, smaller contribution than the portion of Vermont that is flowing into Lake Champlain.
All right. One other question now.
Yeah.
On the 3-acre permit, does it take into account what type of soils are there when or is it just a general one cookie pattern that, hey, it's over 3 acres, it all has to meet this requirement?
Emily, do you want me to take that one?
Oh, sure. Thank you, Secretary Moore.
Sure. For the record, Julie Moore, the Stormwater Management Manual does take into account soil conditions. It prioritizes or encourages people to look at soaking water away, infiltrating it into the ground, either through disconnection, meaning taking a downspout from a roof and turning it out into a yard and encouraging it to spread out and soak away, or certain types of practices. But it recognizes that, for example, in Addison County, there's some really heavy clay soils that have a hard time infiltrating that water. So while it encourages you to look through infiltration practices first and determine if they can work, ultimately it will allow a range of practices to be considered based on the site-specific nature of where a project is being built.
Okay, and then one follow-up to that.
Yep.
Like Addison County Field Days, that is only used for 5 days out of the week and then periodically for a lot smaller events. Is that calculated into it, or it doesn't matter that it's, and if not, why not?
Sure. So we have certain types of programs that consider days of use. Our drinking water program is probably the best example of that, where there are less rigorous standards for systems that only serve a small number of people, a small number of days per year. When it comes to managing stormwater runoff, in some ways, the lake doesn't care if there are people at Addison County Field Days or not. The impacts that are being seen in Lake Champlain, in Otter Creek, and whatever the local tributaries are being driven by the fact that there are parking lots and building roofs, and that stormwater, rainwater is washing across those surfaces. And so while having people there may increase slightly the concentration of pollutants, it's not the primary driver of the pollutants that our stormwater rules look to address.
So it's just the water runoff, whether it's clean water or if it's during the fair, could be very muddy water or debris in that water. And I for my purpose more, why isn't that taken into consideration? Because if a parking lot that has nobody using it, is the water coming off it is fairly clean. Whereas
it can be. It depends on how long it's sat between rainfall events is part of it. And I think certainly there are ways you could increase the complexity of our regulatory programs to try to better account for that. I don't think we have great data. We know from research that's been done elsewhere, sort of the biggest determinant of pollutant loads off of impervious surfaces is the time between rainfall events as opposed to any use. And so I understand and have certainly heard from the Fairs and Field Days concern that they're only using that site a handful of days per year, but the fact is the impervious surface exists 365 days a year. We have created a grant program with some of the ARPA dollars to try to help offset the costs of the improvements we're asking them to make. And I think all of the fairs have taken advantage of that funding source at this point.
I'd still like to see the data that in between the rain events, that if it's a parking lot or a impermeable surface, it's not being used, it may be just dust. I take it from a storm.
Yeah, there's atmospheric deposition, there's leaves, there are people who walk their dogs and the pet waste that remains behind, there's bird waste. I mean, there's a lot of different components to it, and I've heard the concerns. There is no straightforward way to do what you're asked, and if we start creating tiered regulations for stormwater management that rely on the number of days of occupancy, whether it's a farm and field day or a seasonal campground or what have you, and speaking as the secretary of an agency that includes our Department of Forest Parks and Recreation, that has I think a dozen or more state park facilities that are required to implement stormwater management practices, it can get really complicated really quickly, and I'm not sure it actually has the practical effect that maybe you're looking for, in that it will. We've assumed an average concentration per acre, and if we start subtracting acres for different reasons or reducing the level of treatment provided, we're going to have to get those pounds from elsewhere.
We'll move on.
Thank you. For the record, my name is Claire Madden. I'm the Tracking and Accounting Supervisor with the Clean Water Initiative Program. So Emily spoke about the tactical basin planning process, identifying strategies and actions to address water quality concerns. And so I just wanted to share what those can look like. We generally categorize our clean water projects into 5 primary land use sectors, based on the type of project and the land area that's being treated by the project. And for the most part, clean water projects function to slow down and infiltrate water where that's possible before it reaches our waterways. And they also work to reduce the erosive energy of large volumes of water moving across the landscape. You've heard a little bit about the connection between clean water and flood resilience. We think it's really important, particularly in light of a couple of years of really devastating flooding across the state, to continue to draw the connection that water quality improvement work provides flood resiliency benefits through that infiltration and reduction of erosive energy in our waterways. Clean water projects can also provide other types of co-benefits, some of which might include improved habitat function and biodiversity, increased carbon sequestration, improved soil health, workforce development, and local economic stimulus. Next slide, please, Emily. We collect 4 primary categories of data to include in our reporting. Investment measures show all state funding awarded and spent towards clean water work. Education measures demonstrate the scale of state-supported efforts in outreach and technical assistance to support the clean water workforce and network in implementing our clean water priorities. Project output measures are standardized metrics that quantify the impact of clean water investments, and pollution reduction measures are modeled estimates of nutrient load reductions that have been achieved through the implementation of clean water projects. For now, we're reporting on estimated phosphorus reductions in the Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog basins, and in the future anticipate also tracking nitrogen reductions in the Connecticut River drainage. So let's get into some of the data. Next slide, please. This figure shows state investments in clean water over the reporting timeframe, organized by land use sector and state fiscal year. The high-level takeaway is that the state has invested over $600 million in clean water since state fiscal year 2016, when this reporting exercise began. And we report on funding as it's awarded, but the results of investments are often not available in the same year that the funding award is made. So there's a lag time between these dollars out the door and the data back on the impact of those investments. As you might notice, we're in a pretty impressive uptick here in state fiscal year 23 and 24 in terms of funding availability for clean water. That is almost entirely the result of dollars made available through the Federal American Rescue Plan Act, or ARPA. And most of that money has been funneled to the stormwater and wastewater sectors, but Agency of Agriculture did receive a fair amount of ARPA funding to support clean water work as well. Next slide, please, Emily. This slide shows the same figure on state investments in clean water, now organized by funding source, just to highlight the role that ARPA is currently playing in funding availability in the clean water space. I will note that ARPA dollars are short-term funding availability. They had to be encumbered by the end of calendar year 2024, and they need to be spent by the end of calendar year 2026. So while we're fortunate to have this great influx of this funding source from the federal administration now, we expect that that will play a declining role in future funding availability. Next slide, please. All right, this slide shows a selection of project output metrics. I selected one from each sector out of dozens that we track and report on. You can see in the agricultural sector, almost 250,000 acres of agricultural conservation practices have been implemented over the reporting period. So that includes things like cover crops and no-till or conservation tillage, those types of practices. I will note on this throughout the presentation, but this is one area where we do acknowledge a data availability lag in terms of the outputs that we're able to report on in the most recent state fiscal year, because this reporting exercise runs on a state fiscal year cycle, which turns over on July 1st. That falls right in the middle of the growing season. So much of the data on practices implemented in the most recent year isn't available until the following year of reporting. Each year that we do this report, we retroactively backfill any missing data, so we have an opportunity to compile a more comprehensive picture of implementation. So we do expect that that point for state fiscal year 2024 and the agricultural measures to go up next year when we have a more complete data set for the most recent year. In the natural resource sector,
I'm sorry, are you through this slide?
I'm not quite yet, but
Okay.
I'm happy to take your question now.
Yeah, if you could go to the one before this.
Sure.
And note that again, in 2023, we spent 93 million, and in 2024, it's doubled. I'm wondering, since you referenced that they were one-time funds, were there positions created that fall to the general fund to keep funding them after that one time? In other words, if you create a position, somebody gets hired and they get a salary, and then the one-time funding's gone, what happens now?
Yeah, I'm happy to start, and then I think Emily probably has a bit to chime in. My understanding is that the administration of ARPA dollars was carried by a lot of different programs throughout the state government, including some temporary positions or limited service positions, and as well as some permanent positions that sort of reprioritize workload to be able to take advantage of this one-time funding, and will return to other workload when the urgency of this funding is reduced. But maybe Emily has more to add on that.
Yeah, sure. That was a great start, Claire. Thank you. And yes, Agency of Natural Resources has received some additional limited service positions to support the administration of the ARPA funding. But those positions are limited service and are due to expire when the ARPA performance period ends, which is the dollars need to be expended by December of 2026. And I'm not aware of any proposal to move those positions onto general fund, but that would probably be a question we could follow up on if there's additional information that you would like related to the status of those positions.
Yeah, I'm just curious. I mean, it seems logical that if it's the same number of people, somebody made a lot more money one year than they did the year before, if there were more money available, or there were more positions created, which again, at some point, when the federal money dries up, now what do we do, kind of thing. So yeah, I'd be interested in seeing a little more information on that, I think.
I'll make note of that. Thank you for your question.
Thanks, Emma. Yep.
All right. We could move ahead, Emily. Great. All right, a couple of other metrics here. I think that the thing to note is that not every metric that we track is demonstrating an increasing trend. Some metrics that we track are tracking a regulatory compliance timeline and have an expected sort of curve of performance, I'll say, and others we've noted a need to use that adaptive management approach that Emily described in the planning and the framework of all of this work to understand where the gaps are and work through some programmatic development to continue furthering our progress. Next slide, please. This slide shows a couple of key takeaways from the Lake Champlain TMDL. The graph on the left side of the screen shows the modeled baseline. That's sort of like the starting point of the TMDL. And the middle graph shows the allocation. That is the budget that we talked about. That is the amount of phosphorus loading per year that the Lake Champlain Basin can withstand while still meeting water quality standards. The larger pie chart on the right is the difference or our reduction goals. And so you can see here, every land use sector has a role to play in achieving the phosphorus load reductions in the TMDL. The agricultural sector has a large role to play, partly because of the contributions of the agricultural land area to the loading in Lake Champlain. But the forest and stream sectors, the natural resource sector has a pretty significant reduction target. And the developed land sector there also has a role to play in meeting our water quality targets. The purple section of the pie chart is representing the margin of safety. That is the buffer that Emily spoke about earlier. That is accounting for the uncertainties in future loading that might come through climate events, climate change related events. So that's the allocation that's been set to create a buffer for that uncertainty.
On the phosphorus, how much is legacy? Do they have an equation on that? That is legacy that's just in the ground that's going to keep coming and coming?
Yeah, it's a good question. To my knowledge, the Lake Champlain TMDL didn't account for legacy phosphorus and the role that loading plays, that legacy phosphorus loading plays. But we do acknowledge that that is absolutely a factor in Lake Champlain. And there is a section in the report, chapter 6 includes a little bit more description on the role of legacy phosphorus and the history of land use contributing to this lake bed sediments in Lake Champlain. So that is absolutely a factor. The goal of the TMDL is to reduce additional loading to the lake on an annual basis. Although, there might be other management strategies needed as well. So,
thanks.
Sure.
Just had a follow-up question, if I may. Was your question on legacy phosphorus related to legacy phosphorus in soils or in the lake itself?
One is soils, but I didn't even think of the lake, so both, I guess. Yeah.
Great, thank you for clarifying. Yeah, I will just add that the modeling that was done for the Lake Champlain TMDL, it looked at what the range of loading would be from the different land uses based on the land use type, the soil type, and slope. And so that is what was baked into looking at what the base load is and what the targets would be for reducing phosphorus, and the amount of that's expected to be delivered from the watershed, from the landscape into the lake. And so it does acknowledge that there's sort of a range of phosphorus saturations or phosphorus levels in different land uses depending on the land use characteristics. And then that was calibrated based on the actual water quality modeling for the tributaries, the rivers that flow into Lake Champlain. So in some ways that was already baked into the baseline modeling in terms of soils, but that a lot of the work that's being done, especially in the agricultural sector, is looking at improving soil health. And well, Laura DePietro's in the room, so feel free to jump in if I'm getting over my skis, Laura. But it looks at the different types of practices that can improve soil health and help to achieve more of a phosphorus balance in the soils that will ultimately reduce the phosphorus pollution that's flowing into our waterways. And then in the lake itself, as Claire mentioned, for many decades, we have been putting excess phosphorus pollution into the lake. And so it will take time for the lake itself to recover from that excess phosphorus pollution that is in the sediment of the lake bed. And so that is baked into the modeling and the targets for Lake Champlain. But the exact response time of how long it will take the lake to respond to all of the work that's happening on the landscape, that's something that we need to continue to study and look at whether there's need to do in lake treatments to address some of those legacy phosphorus. Because when we have warm weather, for example, it can cause a dynamic in the water column where that internal phosphorus loading can really be released up into the water column and also be a contributing factor to cyanobacteria blooms. So further monitoring and study and possibly further action may be needed to address that source as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, next slide, please, Emily.
We got probably about 8 minutes left, so
Sure.
if we can make it through, great, but if there's some highlights that you want to hit us, feel free to take over.
Thank you, Chair. All right, this would be one highlight, and I think addresses a question from earlier. So this slide shows estimated phosphorus reductions by land use sector and state fiscal year on the left, and total overall estimated progress towards reaching the TMDL target in the Lake Champlain Basin on the right. We're about 26% of the way to our goal. And you can see that agriculture has and continues to play a really large role in the estimated phosphorus reductions we're able to account for. We anticipate seeing some growth in the contributions of other sectors, particularly the stormwater and transportation-related stormwater sectors in the coming years as a result of the implementation of those regulations that we spoke about earlier, addressing the developed land sector. Next slides, please. I'm just going to mention that the next two slides show the same data, but for the Memphremagog Basin, it's available there and explained in the report, but maybe I'll skip over those just for the purpose of time. We're about 17% in the Memphremagog. This slide, oops, sorry. This slide shows the estimated phosphorus reductions we reported in this year's performance report in the lighter purple bars, and the darker purple outlines show the estimated phosphorus reductions we reported last year for the same state fiscal year. The reason that I share this slide is it's a good illustration of the role that data availability plays in what we're able to report. So if you focus just on the bar for state fiscal year 2023, where the cursor is now, you can see that this year we were able to backfill a bunch of data that we didn't have available to us when we were preparing the report last year, and it really bumped up the estimated phosphorus reductions that we're able to account for in that year. I make note of that because there has been an acknowledgement that the most recent year of reporting appears to be sort of a downward trend or a falling off of progress. We do hope and anticipate that that will look different next year when we have a more complete data set. Next slide, please. This slide, the text on the slide is hyperlinked, and there's a QR code that will lead you to an interactive portal to view more data if you're interested. It includes all of the data that was compiled to prepare the performance report and allows for some interactivity to view by sector or by specific geographic region. Before we wrap up, I'd love to just take a moment to acknowledge the clean water community, the network of partners that are on the ground doing this work on behalf of the state and our water quality. We collect data from the Agency of Administration, Agency of Commerce and Community Development, Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Agency of Natural Resources, and Agency of Transportation, as well as the Lake Champlain Basin Program, USDA, NRCS, and the Vermont Housing and Conservation Board. And that represents over 50 programs working to support clean water work in the state across a range of scales, sectors, and geographies. And really all the successes that we're able to capture and boil down in the data that's provided in the report is thanks to the work of those folks on the ground implementing projects and making connections in their communities to further our goals. Next slide, please. I'll risk speaking outside of my area of expertise, just provide a few project highlights from the most recent report. The picture on the left shows a grass filter strip that was installed in the Memphremagog watershed in 2024. So as you all probably know, these vegetated strips are planted along the edge of a field, in between a field and a waterway. The waterway is that tree line running sort of diagonally through the picture, and the filter strip is implemented on both sides. These are really effective at trapping sediment and the nutrients that are stored in sediments from running off of the field, and they sort of get caught in the filter strip before reaching the waterway. Really effective and very cost-effective practice for reducing phosphorus load into our waterways. And on the right is a barnyard improvement project that was installed through Agency of Agriculture's Best Management Practice Program. This is an effective practice to reduce the runoff associated with outdoor animal enclosures. Particularly in the winter, without a cover, an outdoor enclosure can result in a lot of runoff, and installing a cover provides that benefit of allowing access to the outdoors, and also protects water quality. All right, I think I'll skip over the next two project highlights. Happy to talk about them if there's time, or you'll catch me out afterwards, but just wrap up here with a couple of closing thoughts. And so this reporting process is a really helpful tool in assessing our progress and informing our management planning, and employing that adaptive management approach on a secular basis to really improve our comprehensive approach to water quality across the state. We're doing a lot of impactful work, and some of that might be underrepresented in the data that we have available to us. We do fill data gaps each year of the reporting process. We acknowledge that there's a lot of money in the water quality space right now, a lot of funding available, and we also need to support the capacity of our network, which we're doing through several programs investing in workforce development and capacity building of the partners, the network that is doing this work on the ground. Programs designed under Vermont's Clean Water Act, regulatory programs designed under Vermont's Clean Water Act are really hitting the ground now in terms of implementation, and we anticipate that contributing to the results that we're able to quantify and report in future years. And Emily spoke a little bit about a shift in how we're administering funding programs. Some of our grant programs are now being administered by regional partners working to administer funding of individual projects. This transition has been made in order to scale the amount of funding that can be distributed to clean water work, but we recognize that it also represents a bit of a learning curve from some entities that are operating in a new capacity, and the scaling of those investments and the impacts associated with that scaling will take time to reflect. We're also continuing to expand the tracking and accounting systems that we use to capture the results of our clean water efforts, and employing that adaptive management approach to identify gaps and develop programs to fill those gaps.
I might add too, because we have two new members of institutions on here, and then, well, and one current and then one past. A lot of the monies in 2024 was the efforts of what the institutions committee did as far as taking $17 million in seed money and securing some monies for the American Rescue Plan monies to further these goals. So it's kind of a cross look about how committees working together to to further goals and where it might impact another committee. So, well, thank you. Sorry to rush you at the end, but I just didn't think it would be worth coming back for a couple of slides. We appreciate it again, as always. Brand new committee, so to be able to understand, how all this connects again, like with my last comments, and then what you folks are doing. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Sherry. I'm happy to come back anytime.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Committee I'm going to, Linda's passed me a note today, Agency of Ag and Food and Markets at 3:15 to 4:45. They're in the cafeteria with agriculture products producers. And so if you have a minute to swing through there. And then tomorrow at between 4 and 5, the Vermont Cannabis reception's in the cafeteria as well.
With free trials?
Yeah.
You beat me to it.
The time for the ag producers, is that correct? Because I had a different time.
Well, Linda will.
I know well, no one
That's
here
what
would
they
know.
listed.
That's what they listed
Yeah.
today.
But, yeah.